Single mom left on the road until a stranger stopped. The sky stretched endlessly over the Kansas plains, a dull gray canvas smeared with late summer heat. The wind carried dust in slow, swirling ghosts across the empty road. On the side of a forgotten two-lane highway, Ivy Monroe crouched in the brittle grass, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. Junie, just 5, was limp against her chest, cheeks flushed, breathing shallow, her tiny fingers twitching with fever. Ivy's sundress was torn at the hem, her boots scuffed from walking miles under an unforgiving sun. Her throat was dry, her skin sunburnt, but none of that mattered. Only Junie mattered. "Please," Ivy whispered hoarsely, brushing the child's matted hair from her forehead. "Stay with me, baby, just a little longer." Cars passed. None stopped. Some slowed, maybe out of curiosity or guilt, but sped off just the same. Ivy didn't bother standing anymore. Her legs were too tired. Her hope even more so. Just that morning, she'd been thrown out of her sister's trailer. A shouting match, some shattered dishes, and then silence. "You chose that loser," her sister had hissed. "Don't come crawling back now." She had nowhere else to go. Her parents were long gone. The shelters in the next county were full. And now, her daughter was burning up and barely conscious, with only a half-empty bottle of warm Gatorade and a crumpled $20 bill left to her name. Ivy looked down at Junie and bit her lip until it bled. This wasn't survival anymore. This was desperation. She didn't see the old pickup truck until she heard the engine slow, gravel crunching beneath tires. Her shoulders tensed. People didn't stop. Not anymore. Not unless they wanted something. Fenton, Ron. Kumensinton, Jonakakam Sazal. A door creaked open. Boots hit the ground. A shadow stretched beside them. Pock. Plock. But Ivy didn't move. Couldn't. And then came a voice, low and calm, like the wind before a storm. "Your girl's not doing well. I've got a cooler full of ice water and a place 5 minutes down the road. No strings, just help." She finally looked up and saw him. Dust-covered jeans, a faded plaid shirt, crow's feet around quiet eyes. A man who looked like he belonged to the land and like he hadn't smiled in a long time. Shikar. He took a step back, gave her space, and placed a sealed water bottle on the grass. Then he said, gently, "Name's Mason. I'll leave the truck door open. If you need a ride, it's there." And with that, he walked away, back to the truck, and waited. Ivy stared at the water, at her child. Then, slowly, her fingers moved. Not because she trusted him, but because she had no one left, and he hadn't turned away. The truck's engine hummed like a lullaby as it rumbled down the county road. Ivy sat in the passenger seat, her daughter curled against her chest beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of hay and peppermint. The air conditioning kissed her face with a chill she hadn't felt in days. But it was the silence that surprised her most. Not uncomfortable, not pressing, just quiet. Mason kept his eyes on the road. His hands were large, steady on the wheel, browned from years in the sun. He didn't glance at her, didn't ask questions, didn't even introduce himself again. He simply drove, as if transporting desperate mothers and half-conscious children was something he did every Tuesday. Every now and then, Ivy looked down at Junie, checking her breathing. The girl had stirred a little, murmured something about butterflies in her sleep. It was the first sound she'd made in hours. Ivy didn't know if it meant hope, but it was something to hold on to. 15 minutes passed before Mason turned onto a gravel driveway that led to a small farm tucked between two hills. A red barn stood near a weathered farmhouse, its porch lights glowing like a promise in the dusk. Ivy's breath hitched. He parked, killed the engine, then reached into the back and pulled out a small cooler. Without a word, he opened it, pulled out a clean rag, soaked it in ice water, and handed it to her. She flinched when their fingers brushed, and he immediately stepped back. "For her forehead," he said simply. "Fever's climbing fast. You'll want to keep her cool." Ivy took the cloth, pressed it gently to Junie's flushed face, and swallowed hard. She wanted to say thank you, but the words tangled in her throat, too tight with exhaustion and disbelief. Mason walked around the truck and opened the front door of the house. There's a spare room down the hall, beds made, bathrooms clean, you can stay the night. Still, no questions, no expectations. Ivy hesitated. Then, gathering Junie close, she stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. The porch creaked beneath her weight. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and something baking, maybe apples. She found the room easily. There were folded towels at the end of the bed, a bowl of cool water on the nightstand, a fresh pillow. Sully hen. Mason didn't follow her in. He just said, from the hall, I'll be up early. Coffee's on at 5. Holler if she gets worse. And then he disappeared down the stairs. Ivy laid Junie on the bed, pulled the blanket to her chin, and sat beside her, one hand stroking tangled hair, the other gripping the cold rag like a lifeline. The child stirred faintly. Mama, she whispered. I'm here, baby, Ivy said, voice trembling. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the night fell thick and starless. But inside that old farmhouse, for the first time in a long time, Ivy didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel safe. Not yet. But she didn't feel alone. The moonlight crept across the floorboards, silver and soft. Ivy sat on the edge of the bed, watching Junie's chest rise and fall in gentle rhythm. The fever hadn't broken yet, but the girl no longer whimpered in her sleep. Her lips, once cracked and pale, were now pink with returning color. Ivy dared not hope too much, but it was something. She slipped out of the room on aching legs, barefoot, careful not to wake the child. The hallway was quiet, lit by a single bulb near the stairs. The farmhouse had the kind of stillness that wasn't sterile or cold, but lived in, like the house itself had witnessed years of pain, healing, and quiet things that mattered. In the kitchen, Ivy found a pot of warm water still sitting on the stove. A folded note lay beside it. For her compresses. Towels in the drawer. Use whatever you need. No name signed. Just a steady scroll, written in the kind of handwriting that came from someone who didn't speak more than necessary. Her hands hovered over the note for a moment before moving to the drawer. Inside were clean, soft towels folded precisely. Another basin sat beneath the sink. Ivy filled it and returned to the room, placing it gently on the floor. She didn't notice it at first, not until she reached for the corner of the bed and her hand brushed something hard and smooth, a small wooden hairbrush. Its handle worn by years of use, its bristles soft but aged. A strip of faded pink ribbon was tied around the end. Taped beneath it was another note. My daughter used to love this one. Hope it helps. Ivy's breath caught. She hadn't asked. She hadn't spoken. And yet, this man, this stranger, had left behind the only kind of comfort he seemed to know how to give. Quiet, simple, unspoken. She sank to her knees beside Junie and slowly brushed through her tangled hair. The little girl shifted in her sleep, then murmured, "It smells nice, Mama." Ivy let out a choked sound that was almost a laugh, and then, finally, painfully, she cried. Not the silent kind she'd learned to master, not the tears held back behind clenched teeth, but open, shaking sobs that echoed off the walls of a room she didn't know, in a home she didn't belong to. But no one told her to stop. No one told her to be quiet. Down the hall, Mason sat on the back steps of the barn, arms resting on his knees, staring out into the field. He didn't move when he heard her crying. He didn't interrupt. He simply stayed. Axes. It had been a long time since someone's grief moved anything in him. But tonight, it did. Not because of pity, but because something in Ivy's silence reminded him of the ache he thought he'd buried. A storm doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it's a quiet knock on your door. And sometimes the healing comes just as softly. Morning came slow and pale, casting golden streaks through the faded curtains. The air in the room was still cool from the night, but the silence was no longer heavy. It felt restful, like the house itself had taken a deep breath. Ivy stirred on the small sofa beside the bed, her back stiff from the awkward position. The first sound she heard wasn't the creak of floorboards or the hum of farm life. It was Junie's giggle, light, raspy, but real. Her eyes flew open. The child sat propped up against the pillow, cheeks pink, a paper bird in her lap. She was running her small fingers along the delicate folds. "Mama?" she whispered with wonder. "Look what I found?" Ivy blinked and pushed herself up. On the nightstand sat a tray, 2 pieces of toast, a boiled egg, and a cup of milk. Next to it, a folded paper crane with careful writing on one wing. "For Junie." Ivy's throat tightened. She touched the paper bird gently, then glanced toward the door. She hadn't heard him come in. Junie munched on toast, swinging her legs beneath the blanket, her energy slowly returning like morning sun climbing over the hills. Later, as Ivy stepped out of the room, she found another note on the hallway floor folded into a tiny airplane. "If she's feeling better, come see the garden, I'll be there." It was unsigned again, but she didn't need a name. The farmhouse kitchen was clean, sun-drenched. A kettle whistled gently on the stove, already cooling. The scent of apple jam lingered in the air, and on the counter a small jar had been labeled "Sweet for Sore Hearts" in the same blocky handwriting. Junie clutched the paper crane as they stepped outside together. Beyond the porch, Mason knelt in the dirt near a raised garden bed, wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow. His hands moved through mint and rosemary like he knew every stem by name. When he heard footsteps, he looked up, but didn't speak. Just nodded once, slow and sure. Ivy walked forward, Junie held to her hip. The wind brushed through the fields, and for the first time in weeks, the world didn't feel like it was closing in. They stayed like that for a while, saying nothing, sharing nothing. Just 3 souls beneath the open sky, bound not by explanation, but by the quietness of being seen. The mail came late that day. It arrived tucked into a rusty metal box at the end of the long gravel drive. 3 envelopes, 1 water bill, 1 seed catalog, and the third thicker, official. Ivy recognized the seal before she opened it. Jefferson County Family Court, petition for custody. Her hand trembled as she walked back up the drive. Junie was humming on the porch, coloring with the box of crayons Mason had quietly placed beside her that morning. Ivy said nothing. She didn't want to frighten her. But inside, the storm had already broken loose. She sat at the kitchen table, tore open the envelope, and read the words that blurred before her eyes. Petitioner, Colleen Maddox. Relation, maternal aunt. Grounds, parental instability, endangerment, mental duress. Requested relief, full custody of minor child Juniper Maddox, age 5. Ivy's fingers went numb. Colleen, her sister, the same sister who threw them out barely a week ago, the same one who said, "She's not my problem." The room spun. Her heart pounded in her ears. Junie's voice floated in from the porch. "Mama, look! I drew you and me and Mr. Mason. We're under the sunflower tree." Ivy shoved the paper into the drawer and forced her voice steady. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." But Junie had already stepped inside, clutching the drawing. She saw the mail on the table, the name printed in bold letters, Juniper Maddox. She frowned. "Is that about me?" Ivy dropped to her knees and hugged her fiercely, so tight the girl gasped. "No one's taking you?" she whispered. "Not ever." Junie blinked. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby. You're perfect. You're mine." From the hallway, Mason stood in the shadows. He had seen the envelope in her hand when she came in. He didn't speak, didn't ask, but his presence filled the doorway like an anchor. "I don't know what to do," Ivy finally said, her voice cracking. "They'll say I'm unstable, that I don't have a job, a real home, that I'm not fit." Mason stepped forward, slow and certain. He crouched beside her, looked her in the eye. "If they try to take her," he said softly, "they'll have to go through me too." Ivy stared at him, stunned. "She's all I have." "That's exactly why we'll fight." There was no dramatic vow, no swelling music, just a quiet agreement between two broken people. That love was enough of a reason to stand. How are you feeling about the story so far? I'd really love to know what you think. Did it touch your heart or maybe remind you of something from your own life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're at it, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? I'd love to see how far this story travels. It started with the silence. At first, Ivy thought she imagined it. The way conversations hushed the moment she walked into the general store, the way the cashier avoided eye contact, how the old man on the porch no longer tipped his hat. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd grown used to being overlooked. But this wasn't invisibility. This was scrutiny. The way the town was small, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew when a stranger showed up on Mason Decker's land, especially a woman with a child and a past no one cared to understand. "She's the Maddox girl, ain't she?" Ivy heard one woman whisper at the post office. The one whose kid's daddy ran off, or died, or something like that. At the bakery, she waited 20 minutes in line only to be told, "We're out of bread, hon." Ivy looked past the woman at the shelves, stacked with warm loaves. She didn't argue, just nodded and left. Outside, Junie tugged at her hand. "Why don't they smile at you?" Ivy forced a small smile. "Maybe they're just having a bad day." "Every day?" Junie asked, her brow furrowed. Bah! She didn't have an answer. Back at the farmhouse, Ivy set her purse on the kitchen table and reached for the skillet. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't lift it. She leaned forward, both palms flat on the counter, breathing hard. Her chest tightened with a familiar weight. Shame, fear, exhaustion, all curling together like smoke. "Mama?" Junie's voice came from the living room, small and scared. Ivy didn't turn. "I'm okay, baby." But she wasn't. She sank to the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the tile. She didn't cry, she just stayed there, holding herself together one breath at a time. That's where Mason found her. When the Sankutcha fixes, Diva Sankuts Rathis Brul Hasits. He came in from the barn, dirt on his boots and worry in his eyes. He didn't speak, he didn't ask what happened. He knelt beside her and took her trembling hand in his. She looked at him, her face drawn, eyes swollen with tears she refused to shed. "I'm making things worse for you," she whispered. "I see the way they look at you now, like you've let someone like me into a life too good for me." Mason didn't flinch. His grip didn't loosen. "If anyone in this town thinks I'm a fool for opening my door to a woman who carried her child through fire," he said, voice low and steady, "then maybe I don't care much for their opinion." She stared at him. He didn't look away. "You didn't ask to be here, Ivy," he added, "but I'm glad you are." She blinked quickly, heart twisting at the simplicity of his words. There was no pity in them, only presence. That night, after Junie had gone to sleep, Mason took Ivy out past the edge of the garden, where the windmill creaked and the stars hung low. They didn't speak for a long time. The grass was cool beneath them, the silence soft and steady. "You can stay quiet when the world is screaming," Mason said finally, "but you don't have to stay quiet when you're with me." And in that moment, Ivy didn't feel judged. She didn't feel like a burden. She felt seen. The windmill turned slowly above them, its blades creaking like a lullaby long forgotten. Ivy sat cross-legged in the grass, her arms wrapped around her knees, the night cool against her sunburned skin. Beside her, Mason leaned back against the base of the windmill, one leg stretched out, the other bent, his hand idly plucking blades of grass as if time didn't need hurrying. They hadn't spoken for a while, but it was the kind of silence that invited truth, not the kind that demanded it. Finally, Ivy drew in a breath that shook as it left her. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice low, "if someone saw all of you, the ugly parts, the broken ones, if they'd still stay?" Mason didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained on the sky. "I wonder that every day," he said. "And most days I still don't have an answer." Ivy nodded slowly. She looked down at her hands, the scar on her knuckle from when she'd tried to fix a window herself, the calluses from odd jobs that never paid enough, the tremble that hadn't left since the court papers arrived. "I didn't used to be this person," she whispered. "I used to laugh loud. I used to have friends. I had a plan. I had freedom. She swallowed hard. Then I met Levi, Junie's father. He was charming. He knew all the right words. He told me I was the only one who understood him. She laughed bitterly. Then he started controlling everything. My phone, my money, my hours. And when I tried to push back, he'd get quiet. Or loud. Either way, it worked. Mason listened, still as the soil beneath them. The night he left, Junie had a fever. He said I made her sick because I was weak. He packed his bag, slammed the door, and I never saw him again. Not even a goodbye. Ivy wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her hoodie. I didn't even grieve. Not really. I was just numb and afraid. And when I finally asked my sister for help, she said, "You made your bed, Ivy. Now lie in it." Mason's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "That's the thing, isn't it?" she murmured. "You carry something for so long, and people stop seeing it. They just think it's who you are." Mason shifted, turning to face her fully. "I see you," he said quietly. "And it's not what you think." "What do you see?" she asked, her voice breaking. He took a breath. "I see a mother who didn't stop moving, even when her world fell apart. I see someone who's been hurt deeply, but hasn't passed that pain on. I see someone still here, still trying, still showing up for her kid. And that's not weakness, Ivy, that's strength most people can't understand." The words hit deeper than she expected. Her eyes brimmed again, but she didn't turn away. "I'm so tired of proving myself," she whispered. "You don't have to prove anything here," he said. "You just have to be." A soft breeze passed between them, carrying the scent of mint and earth. Somewhere far off, an owl called. The windmill creaked again, slow and steady. Ivy exhaled. She didn't smile. Not yet. But the weight in her chest felt a little lighter. Not because the world had changed, but because, for once, she didn't have to carry it alone. The next morning arrived with a quiet knock, not on a door, but in the form of a car rolling up the drive. Ivy spotted it through the kitchen window while rinsing dishes. A dusty green sedan, polished but old. From it stepped a woman dressed in a sand-colored coat, her silver hair pinned into a no-nonsense twist. She carried no suitcase, just a canvas tote and the weight of old grief settled behind steady eyes. Mason wiped his hands on a dish towel. "That's my mother," he said simply. He didn't explain further. Ivy didn't ask. Eleanor Decker had the posture of someone raised to be dignified, but the hands of someone who'd worked soil. She didn't smile as she stepped onto the porch. Didn't scowl either, just observed. She greeted Mason with a nod, accepted his hug without returning it fully, then turned her attention to the small figure peeking through the screen door. "Junie." "And who might you be?" Eleanor asked gently. "Junie," the girl said, half hiding behind the curtain. "That's a good name," Eleanor replied. "Short, sweet, and strong." Junie smiled and ducked away. Inside, the house was filled with the scent of cinnamon and coffee. Ivy tried to stay out of the way, unsure of her place in this quiet reunion. But Eleanor noticed everything. The extra bowl already placed at the table, the way Ivy instinctively cut Junie's toast into triangles, the tension in her shoulders every time footsteps drew close. After breakfast, Eleanor stood at the porch railing, her gaze sweeping over the horizon. Ivy joined her after some hesitation, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You have a steady touch with that girl," Eleanor said, her tone unreadable. "She's my whole world," Ivy answered, her voice soft. "That's easy to say. Harder to prove when life gets rough." "I don't want anything from Mason," Ivy said quickly. "I'm not here to take advantage. We were just desperate." Eleanor nodded slowly. "You talk like someone who's been accused before." "I have," Ivy said. "By family. By people who never saw what was really happening. Just the mess I was left standing in." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she said, "I lost a child too. Years ago. Not in a crash. Not to illness. Just to time. To choices. We don't talk anymore. Sometimes grief doesn't come all at once. It spreads. It takes." Ivy blinked, caught off guard by the confession. "I'm not here to judge you," Eleanor added. "I'm here to understand what my son is opening his home, and maybe his heart, too." "I'm not asking to stay forever," Ivy said. "I just want her to feel safe, even for a little while." Eleanor studied her, then nodded. "No one stays forever," she said, "but the ones who stay long enough to matter, they don't have to be perfect, just honest." She turned and stepped back into the house, leaving Ivy alone on the porch, breathless, shaken, but strangely steadier. Inside, Junie laughed from the living room as Mason handed her a paintbrush and a jar of water. And for the first time since arriving at the farm, Ivy didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like someone being slowly, cautiously invited in. The days that followed fell into a rhythm not unlike breathing, quiet, steady, healing. Mornings began with the creak of the screen door, Junie's sleepy footsteps across the floor, and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Ivy would rise early to slice apples or stir oatmeal while Mason fed the horses. Eleanor, true to her nature, said little but left thoughtful marks in the day: a mended pillow seam, a jar of homemade jam on the table, the kettle always full. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of acceptance, just the slow unraveling of suspicion into something gentler. The way Eleanor handed Ivy a clean dish towel without comment. The way Junie started humming again. One afternoon, Ivy found herself beside Mason in the garden, kneeling in the soft soil. Junie sat nearby with a crayon-stained notebook, sketching sunflowers and smiling faces beneath them. Ivy reached into the dirt and pulled out a stubborn weed, shaking the roots clean. "These mint plants," Mason said, brushing his fingers through the fragrant leaves. "They die from the top down. Look sick on the surface, but if the roots are good, they come back." Ivy glanced at the rows of green, thriving where there had once been yellowed stems. "I didn't think anything could grow in me again," she admitted. "Not after everything. Not after losing so much." "You didn't lose it," Mason replied. "You survived it." She paused. "That's not how the world sees it." "It's not about them." Ivy sat back on her heels. The soil clung to her hands, but she didn't mind. For the first time, in what felt like years, her body didn't feel like armor. It felt like home. "Ah." She looked at Mason. "Do you ever think that people only stay if they don't know the whole story?" He smiled slightly. "I know your whole story." Her eyes narrowed, skeptical. "No, you don't. I don't have to know every word to understand the weight of the pages." Her breath caught, more from the quiet truth in his voice than from the words themselves. They finished the row in silence. As they stood to stretch, Ivy brushed soil from her knees. Junie raced ahead toward the house, waving her drawing in the air. "Look," she called to Eleanor on the porch. "It's us under the mint tree. Me, Mama, and Mr. Mason." Eleanor took the paper, studied it with a faint smile, then said, "You forgot one thing." Junie frowned. "What?" "The mint patch," Eleanor replied. "Every good garden has one." That night, after dinner, they sat on the porch, Mason and Ivy on the swing, Junie curled up inside with Eleanor reading her a story. No one spoke, but Ivy felt his hand reach for hers, the calluses warm and steady. Men, he didn't squeeze. Alluin, he didn't promise. Men, he just stayed. And Ivy, for the first time in her adult life, didn't brace herself for the goodbye. She simply leaned in and let herself believe that maybe something real could take root in her too. The courthouse was cold, too cold for a July morning in Missouri. Ivy sat at the front of the courtroom, her hands clutched tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since sunrise. Junie was with Eleanor in the lobby, playing with a paper crane and a pack of colored pencils. Ivy had kissed her forehead before stepping into the room, pretending it was just another errand. But it wasn't. It was everything. Beside her, Mason sat calm and steady, dressed in a clean button-down shirt, and worn boots that still carried the dust of the land he worked. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Behind them, Eleanor sat with her back straight and hands folded in her lap, like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. The judge read from the documents, voice even and impersonal. Ivy barely heard the words. No substantial evidence of instability. Child's best interest maintained by remaining with biological mother. Petition for custody is denied. It took Ivy a few seconds to breathe. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply turned to Mason. Their eyes met. He nodded once, quiet, solid, like the fence posts on his land, and reached for her hand. She let him hold it. No applause followed. No dramatic moment. Just the soft exhale from her chest and the feeling that, for once, the world wasn't trying to push her out. Outside, Junie looked up from her drawing as Ivy approached. She ran into her mother's arms at full speed. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," Ivy whispered, holding her so tight it nearly undid her. That night, dinner was simple. Roasted carrots. Bread from the market. Chicken Eleanor had seasoned herself. Junie chattered about her new best friend at the courthouse, an elderly woman with jelly candies in her purse. Ivy listened, nodded, smiled when appropriate. Mason passed the water pitcher. Eleanor, without a word, scooped another spoonful of mashed potatoes onto Ivy's plate. No speeches were made. No one said this is now a family. But it was mash Billy Axe. Later, after Junie had gone to bed, Ivy and Mason sat on the porch swing. The breeze smelled like damp earth and mint. They didn't talk much. Just listened to the sound of the windmills spinning slow and the crickets humming somewhere in the dark. "I've never stayed anywhere this long," Ivy said after a while. Mason looked at her. And, "I don't want to leave." He didn't smile. He didn't say, "Then stay." He just reached for her hand and held it. Fingers intertwined with hers, steady and warm. Inside, taped to the refrigerator, was Junie's newest drawing. 3 figures under a wide green tree. One tall, one medium, one very small with purple shoes. Above them, in careful child handwriting, was a single word: home. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.